believe behind those threats is what I refer to as rhetoric against law enforcement. And I brought this up last week, and I want to bring this up again with you and give you a chance to briefly address this. These are just roughly 10 of the statements that I was able to easily find online by elected officials, governors, mayors, in many cases members of Congress, where they were spewing what I believe to be very harmful statements toward law enforcement. Governor Pritzker claimed that ICE is grabbing people off the street and disappearing them, that our country is becoming Nazi Germany. Representative Crockett compared ICE to slave patrols. Representative Garcia referred to ICE as thugs. Representative Ramirez attacked ICE as a terror force, later a terrorist organization, and then later in the hearing said, "Let me be clear, the Department of Homeland Security, you can quote..."
Listen, we need to talk about what just happened in that hearing room, and if your stomach isn't churning with righteous fury yet, if your blood isn't absolutely boiling with the moral clarity that this moment demands, then you haven't been paying attention to what's unfolding before our very eyes, in real time across American cities from Charlotte to New Orleans to Minneapolis. This Republican congressman just sat there reading off a litany of Democratic statements comparing ICE to Nazis and slave patrols and terrorist organizations like he's discovered some kind of smoking gun scandal, like he's uncovered evidence of Democratic malfeasance, when what he's actually done is compile a comprehensive list of elected officials who have the courage and the historical literacy and the moral backbone to tell the truth about what ICE has become under this administration. Because here's what they don't want you to understand. Here's the bombshell they're desperately trying to bury under layers of law enforcement reverence and performative outrage. The Trump administration has intensified the criminalization of asylum seekers and immigrants, pushed immigrant detention to all-time highs, and indiscriminately raided city after city, and over 250 people have been arrested in immigration raids in Charlotte since the weekend. The Department of Homeland Security is amending its immigration enforcement operations by moving away from raids targeting all illegal immigrants in the U.S. and focusing more on the ones who have committed serious offenses, only because a YouGov poll last month found that a majority of Americans oppose immigration and customs enforcement operations tied to Trump's immigration crackdown. Wait, you're telling me that an agency conducting mass raids changed tactics because of negative polling numbers? Because that sounds like the behavior of an organization engaged in a political project of cruelty, not legitimate law enforcement protecting public safety. And before you dismiss that as hyperbole, before you retreat into the comfortable mythology of just enforcing the law, let me tell you what's actually happening on the ground right now in December 2025. More than 370 people were arrested in Operation Charlotte's Web, only 44 of whom had any prior criminal record. Let that sink in for a moment. The vast majority were ordinary undocumented residents, people going to work or school, not violent criminals, which underscores that the crackdown is less about public safety than meeting political quotas. This isn't law enforcement. This is social engineering through state violence. This is using the apparatus of federal power to terrorize communities of color. And when Democrats make historical comparisons to other regimes that used police forces to control racialized populations, they're not engaging in inflammatory rhetoric. They're engaging in comparative political analysis. Now here comes the part that's going to make some people uncomfortable. The part that challenges the foundational myths we've been told about American law enforcement. But if we're serious about justice, if we're committed to understanding how systems of oppression operate and persist, we have to reckon with historical truth. The earliest formal slave patrol was created in the Carolinas in the early 1700s with one mission: to establish a system of terror and squash slave uprisings with the capacity to pursue, apprehend, and return runaway slaves to their owners. This isn't radical revisionism. This isn't some fringe academic theory. This is documented American history. Policing in southern slaveholding states had roots in slave patrols, squadrons made up of white volunteers empowered to use vigilante tactics to enforce laws related to slavery. After the Civil War, Southern police departments often carried over aspects of the patrols, including systematic surveillance, the enforcement of curfews, and even notions of who could become a police officer. So when Representative Crockett invokes slave patrols, when elected officials draw these historical parallels, they're not smearing ICE agents. They're pointing to structural continuities in how state violence has been deployed against black and brown bodies across centuries of American history. They're asking us to see the through line from armed white men patrolling to capture escaped slaves to armed federal agents conducting raids in immigrant neighborhoods, demanding papers, separating families, instilling fear. And before anyone clutches their pearls about comparing immigration enforcement to the Holocaust, let's be excruciatingly clear about what that comparison actually means. When Governor Pritzker references Nazi Germany, he's not saying we've built Auschwitz. He's identifying the warning signs of authoritarian government. Agents don't act with as much brutality or impunity if they know they're being recorded, which is precisely why communities are organizing ICE Watch patrols, why they're training thousands of people on what they can legally do when they see an immigration raid unfold. And here's where this gets even more devastating, where the reality on the ground exposes the lie of the criminal enforcement narrative they're selling. 73% have no criminal convictions, and nearly half have no convictions or pending charges, while 5% had been convicted of violent offenses among those in ICE detention, according to data from ICE itself. So when DHS claims they're targeting the worst of the worst of the worst, when they hold up this handful of cases involving violence to justify mass operations, they're engaging in propaganda. They're using exceptional cases to legitimize a dragnet that's sweeping up construction workers and Uber drivers and parents dropping kids at school. 55-year-old construction worker Victor Cruz was detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement on his way home from work, and he has a construction business and a work permit. Yet one of the officers told him, "This means nothing to us," when shown his work authorization. Think about the chilling implications of that statement. A federal agent dismissing legal documentation, exercising unchecked discretion to detain someone with authorization to work, someone who's been in the country for decades, someone who owns a business and employs people. That's not law enforcement. That's arbitrary power. That's the kind of capricious authority that defines authoritarian regimes. And when you have masked khaki-clad agents leaping out with darkly tinted windows, out-of-state license plates, or even no plates at all, conducting what amounts to paramilitary operations on American streets, the Nazi comparison isn't hyperbolic, it's historically informed. But let's talk about what they really don't want us discussing, the dimension of this crisis that reveals the profound moral bankruptcy of these policies. The federal government was holding an average of more than 66,000 people in November, the highest on record, and federal officials and their local law enforcement partners are detaining tens of thousands of asylum seekers and migrants, with detainees moved repeatedly, then deported, or held in poor conditions for weeks or months before asking to go home. We're witnessing a new iteration of family separation, and while it doesn't look exactly like the images from 2018 of toddlers ripped from their mother's arms at the border, it's arguably more insidious because it's happening to families who have been living here for years, for decades, families with mixed status where some members are citizens and others aren't. Parents were picked up during raids on workplaces ranging from farms to meatpacking plants, coming out of check-ins with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or dropping their kids off at school, and ICE appears to have violated protections that still remain in official policies by failing to allow undocumented parents time to find an appropriate caregiver or to make travel plans for their children. CNN found more than 100 U.S. citizen children, separated from deported parents, American citizens left stranded by these enforcement actions, and the administration's border czar Tom Homan has the audacity to say, if you're in the country illegally, and you choose to have a U.S. citizen child, that's on you. Blaming parents for the government's deliberate policy choice to separate families, absolving the state of moral responsibility for the trauma it's inflicting on children. This is where the terror language becomes not inflammatory rhetoric but accurate description. When some of the state's immigrants said they were afraid and were taking precautions, with one Honduran immigrant telling Noticias Telemundo he hadn't left his home in 2 weeks, saying, "We've stopped going to work because our fear is that we'll be stopped. We're shut in, and like me there are many." And New Orleans resident Rocio Tirado said she was delivering groceries and paychecks to families who were too scared to leave their homes. That's terrorism by definition. Terrorism is violence or the threat of violence designed to intimidate a population, to alter behavior through fear. Fearing an encounter with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Customs and Border Patrol, or one of several other federal agencies involved in the crackdowns, many migrants retreated into isolation, with local businesses feeling the blow as workers stayed home, and classroom seats sat empty as immigrant parents dared not drive their kids to school. You're telling me that's not terror? That an entire community is afraid to go to work, to take their kids to school, to seek medical care, to buy groceries? And here's the truly diabolical genius of it. This fear serves the policy objective perfectly, because 1.9 million illegal aliens have voluntarily self-deported since January 2025, according to DHS, which sounds like they're fleeing because they respect the law, but they're actually fleeing because they're terrified of being rounded up, detained in substandard conditions, separated from their children, and deported to countries some have never known. Now let me address the elephant in the room, the thing that Republicans are desperately trying to make into a scandal, this idea that Democratic criticism of ICE is somehow causing violence against agents. The White House literally put out statements claiming Democrats have spent years vilifying ICE as fascists, the Gestapo, and slave patrols, inciting a 1,000% surge in assaults on agents, trying to create a causal link between political speech and violence, which is rich coming from an administration whose leader inspired an actual insurrection against the Capitol. But let's examine this claim on its merits, because Fox News reported that DHS recorded 10 assault events from Jan 21, 2024 to June 30, 2024, and from the day after President Donald Trump took office earlier this year until Monday, the department recorded 79 assault events, representing a 690% increase year over year. So yes, assaults increased, and every single one is too many. Violence against anyone doing their job is unacceptable, but context matters enormously here. When you dramatically escalate enforcement, when you send agents into communities to conduct mass arrests, when you're arrested an average of 350 per day in late January at local jails, then continuing to rise to more than 500 a day on average in August, with arrests in other locations peaking in late May and early June at an average of almost 700 a day, you're exponentially increasing interactions between agents and community members, creating conditions where confrontation becomes more likely. And more fundamentally, political criticism of a government agency is not incitement to violence. Calling ICE the Gestapo might be uncomfortable, might be provocative, but it's political speech analyzing the behavior and function of a federal agency, and if that speech accurately describes authoritarian tactics, if it identifies troubling historical parallels, then it's not inflammatory, it's informative. What's actually inflammatory is conducting raids called Operation Catahoula Crunch, named after hunting dogs, sending agents into cities with military-style operations, while ICE appears to be casting a very wide net and arresting all undocumented immigrants they can locate, regardless of whether they have a criminal record, despite a Dec 3 DHS press release stating that the operation focuses primarily on immigrants charged with violent crimes. That discrepancy between stated mission and actual practice is exactly what Democrats are calling out when they use terms like secret police and thugs and terrorists. They're describing the gap between the sanitized official narrative and the brutal reality that immigrants and their allies are documenting in real time. And speaking of documentation, let's talk about what's happening with oversight and accountability, or rather the complete absence of it. President Trump seeks to curb illegal immigration, but also reduce legal ways to get to the U.S. and stay here, especially for certain nationalities, and it's rocking the agency from the inside, crushing morale and prompting resignations, with at least 1,300 people taking the fork-in-the-road resignation offer for federal employees from U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. The administration is systematically dismantling the infrastructure that provided due process, that protected vulnerable populations, that maintained even minimal standards of care. USCIS is creating positions called Homeland Defenders, who will interview aliens, review applications, and identify criminal or ineligible aliens, and these positions are expected to provide direct support to CBP and ICE, essentially turning what was supposed to be an agency facilitating legal immigration into an enforcement arm of the deportation machine. Meanwhile, in March, TSA began sending the names of all air travelers to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which can then match the list against its own database of people subject to deportation, and send agents to the airport to detain those people, and it led to the arrest of Eni Lucia Lopez Beosa, the college student picked up at Boston Logan Airport on November 20 and deported to Honduras 2 days later, with a former ICE official saying 75% of instances in that official's region where names were flagged by the program yielded arrests. So now we have a surveillance infrastructure where traveling by plane in America means your name is automatically fed to immigration enforcement, where buying a ticket triggers a potential deportation proceeding, where the apparatus of everyday life has been weaponized against undocumented people who have been living here peacefully, many for decades. This is what Representative Ramirez means when she calls ICE a terrorist organization. This is what it looks like when a federal agency operates with such sweeping authority that it can arrest people with work permits, detain pregnant women, and separate them from medical care, deport refugees who were granted legal status decades ago, all while claiming they're targeting violent criminals. A July 2025 analysis of statistics from the Deportation Data Project shows that the proportion of immigrants convicted of violent crimes has dropped from the Biden administration's 10% to 7% during the Trump administration, meaning Trump is actually deporting a smaller percentage of people with violent crime convictions than his predecessor, completely eviscerating the public safety justification for these operations. But here's where we need to zoom out and understand the broader architecture of oppression that these policies serve, because ICE doesn't exist in a vacuum. These enforcement actions aren't random cruelty for its own sake. This is about maintaining racial hierarchy in America, about policing the boundaries of who belongs and who doesn't, about using immigration status as a proxy for race and class to justify state violence against vulnerable populations. For about 80 years, Jim Crow laws mandated separate public spaces for blacks and whites, and enforcing them was part of the police's job, with blacks who broke laws or violated social norms often enduring police brutality, while the authorities didn't punish the perpetrators when African Americans were lynched, nor did the judicial system hold the police accountable for failing to intervene when black people were being murdered by mobs. That history isn't dead, it's not even past, because the structures of racial control simply evolve and adapt to maintain their function under different names. Throughout U.S. history, the justice system has evolved to maintain the oppression of black people, with slavery transitioning into the old Jim Crow laws, which then evolved into the new Jim Crow era we live in today, characterized by systemic racism in the criminal justice system. Immigration enforcement is part of that continuum, and when you see agents with masks conducting raids in predominantly Latino neighborhoods, when you see families torn apart and children traumatized, when you see entire communities living in fear, the historical comparisons aren't inflammatory, they're inevitable. And now we're watching in real time as Democrats are being politically attacked for making these comparisons, as if acknowledging historical patterns is somehow more offensive than the actual contemporary brutality they're describing. This Republican congressman sits there reading quotes about ICE being compared to Nazis like he's scandalized, like he's discovered Democrats being unreasonable, when what he's actually revealed is a list of elected officials who understand that democracies die incrementally, that authoritarian shifts happen through normalizing state violence, that fascism doesn't arrive all at once with jackboots and swastikas, but through gradual erosion of rights, through scapegoating vulnerable populations, through building enforcement apparatuses that operate with minimal oversight. Look at what's happening right now with the Abolish ICE movement resurging among progressives. Images of aggressive immigration arrests in cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, Washington, D.C., New Orleans, and Charlotte, North Carolina, have led to anti-ICE sentiment creeping back into the party's messaging, with Patty Garcia, who is running for Congress in Illinois' 4th Congressional District, saying when she launched her bid, "Let me be clear, F ICE, it's time to abolish ICE and hold Trump and his entire clan accountable." This isn't fringe radicalism. This is a reasonable response to an agency that was only created in 2003, that has consistently demonstrated it cannot be reformed, that serves as an instrument of racialized social control rather than legitimate law enforcement. But mainstream Democrats are terrified to embrace this position because they've internalized Republican framing about law and order, because they're afraid of being painted as soft on immigration. Abolishing ICE has become the radical litmus test Democrats can't resist, according to the National Republican Congressional Committee, though leading Democrats have cast doubt that Abolish ICE is making a messaging comeback, with Democratic leadership trying to distance themselves from the very position that moral clarity demands. This is political cowardice masquerading as pragmatism. This is allowing Republicans to define the terms of debate when we should be challenging the fundamental premise that mass deportation serves any legitimate public interest. Meanwhile, on the ground, actual resistance is emerging not just in traditionally progressive cities, but in places like Appalachia that defy easy political categorization. About 135 people gathered along a highway in Boone, North Carolina, a small Appalachian college town, not known as a hotbed of leftist protest, holding signs reading "Nazis were just following orders too," and "Time to melt the ice," and chanting profane rebukes at immigration and customs enforcement agents rumored to be in the area, with one Appalachian State University student saying, "They came here thinking they wouldn't be bothered." This matters enormously because it was easy enough for politicians to paint resistance to immigration raids as the province of big city liberals or communities of color, but what happens when predominantly white, working-class towns start throwing sand in the gears of the deportation machine? This is the moment where class consciousness threatens to override racial division, where working people across different backgrounds recognize their common interest against systems of oppression, where the manufactured fear of the immigrant other starts breaking down through actual human contact and solidarity, and that terrifies the architects of this deportation regime, because their entire political project depends on keeping working-class whites convinced that their economic precarity is caused by undocumented immigrants, rather than by capital's systematic exploitation of labor, regardless of immigration status. The Republican reading those Democratic quotes doesn't want us connecting those dots, doesn't want us recognizing that Homeland Security officials started broadcasting a plan to target sanctuary jurisdictions from the start of President Trump's second term, putting local leaders directly at odds with Trump's mass deportation campaign because of the law, past litigation, and public sentiment. He certainly doesn't want us understanding that just 38% of American adults approve of Trump's job performance on immigration, according to an AP NORC poll, meaning a majority of Americans actually oppose what ICE is doing despite years of propaganda about criminal aliens and border security. This is why Democratic comparisons to historical atrocities are so important, why refusing to sanitize or normalize what's happening is an act of moral courage rather than inflammatory rhetoric. When you have Attorney General Pam Bondi issuing a directive allowing law enforcement officials to enter the homes of migrants without warrants, when you have 23 people dying in ICE custody since Donald Trump took office, when you have 23 people dying in ICE custody since Donald Trump took office, when you have federal immigration court ruling that undocumented immigrants living in the U.S. are ineligible to be released on bond, potentially subjecting millions of immigrants including longtime residents to mandatory detention while their cases are processed, you're watching the systematic construction of a system that treats human beings as less than human, that criminalizes existence, that uses bureaucratic mechanisms to inflict cruelty, and the cruelty is the point, as the saying goes. This isn't incidental brutality or unfortunate side effects of necessary enforcement. This is deliberate policy designed to terrorize communities, to force voluntary deportations through making life unbearable, to send a message to anyone considering coming to America, that they will face a regime of violence and surveillance and family separation. DHS encourages all illegal aliens to use the CBP Home app to get a free flight home for Christmas and $1,000, framing deportation as a gift, as a service, obscuring the violence that created the conditions where people feel they have no choice but to leave. So when this Republican reads those Democratic statements like he's uncovered a scandal, what he's actually done is compiled a list of people telling the truth, people refusing to use euphemisms, people calling state violence by its proper name. When Representative Garcia calls ICE thugs, when Representative Ramirez calls it a terror force, when Governor Pritzker invokes Nazi Germany, they're not smearing law enforcement, they're accurately describing an agency. The Trump administration remains vulnerable to state and local policy action because despite overwhelming displays of power and intimidating rhetoric, the federal government nonetheless relies heavily on state and local collaboration to enact its mass deportation agenda. This is the opening for resistance, the fact that federal power isn't absolute, that mayors and local officials aren't just criticizing ICE raids in their cities, but are making life harder for federal law enforcement while being careful not to go over the line, and cities are finding ways to push back on unwanted immigration enforcement by the Trump administration enforcement, 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 by the Trump administration. This is why the Republicans are so desperate to criminalize this criticism, to frame Democratic statements as dangerous incitement, because they know that when people understand what's actually happening, when the propaganda is stripped away, and the reality of these enforcement actions is exposed, public opinion turns decisively against them. The hearing clip we just watched is Republican panic masquerading as righteous indignation. They're losing the narrative, losing public support, watching their mass deportation project face resistance, not just from progressive activists but from ordinary Americans who witness these raids, who see their neighbors detained, who recognize that just following orders has never been an adequate moral justification for participating in systems of oppression, and so they retreat to support our law enforcement rhetoric, trying to paint any criticism of ICE as anti-police extremism, hoping we'll forget that the function of law enforcement is supposed to be protecting communities, not terrorizing them. But we're not forgetting, and more importantly, we're not staying silent. When Democrats compare ICE to slave patrols and Nazi operations and terrorist organizations, they're exercising their constitutional obligation to check executive power, to sound the alarm about authoritarian overreach, to refuse complicity with cruelty, and those of us who care about justice, who understand that immigration is fundamentally a human rights issue, who recognize that borders are mechanisms of exclusion that serve capital's interest in creating tiers of exploitable labor, we have to amplify these comparisons. We have to make the historical connections explicit. We have to refuse the sanitized language that obscures violence. This is our moment to choose sides, to decide whether we'll normalize mass deportation as law enforcement or name it as state terror, whether we'll accept Republican framing or challenge the premise entirely. The stakes couldn't be higher because Trump campaigned on conducting the largest deportation operation in U.S. history, vowing to round up 15 to 20 million people, which is more than the estimated 14 million undocumented people living in the U.S. And the only thing standing between that nightmare and reality is popular resistance, is local officials refusing cooperation, is ordinary people documenting abuses and organizing mutual aid and building the kind of solidarity that transcends borders and immigration status. So no, Democrats aren't smearing ICE when they make these historical comparisons. They're warning us about where we're headed if we don't change course. They're honoring the victims of past atrocities by refusing to let history repeat itself without resistance. They're doing exactly what elected officials should do in a democracy, threatening to slide into authoritarianism. And if that makes Republicans uncomfortable, if that challenges the mythology of American exceptionalism, if that forces us to confront ugly truths about state violence and racial hierarchy, then good, because comfort is the enemy of justice, and justice demands we see clearly, speak plainly, and act courageously against the machinery of oppression being constructed in our names.